Welcome back. Today's last
Mike.
Here to talk with South Carolina Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford.
Your mic's off.
Mike.
He announced his challenge to the President.
The House can't hear me.
There we go.
They're stipulating that what I was saying was, of course, intelligent and worth listening to. So, but they couldn't hear me. Okay, great. Welcome back for the day's last full group plenary session. We're here to talk with former South Carolina Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford. 2 weeks ago, he announced his challenge to President Trump for the Republican Party's presidential nomination. He joins us by Skype from Concord, New Hampshire. Governor, welcome to America in One Room.
Well, pleasure to be with you, at least in a virtual sense.
Sorry, well, we'll take that. We have questions from questioners who have been meeting in small groups to discuss the issues facing the country, and we'll begin with Mary Ann. Welcome.
Good evening. I'm from Group 15, and we've been solving problems all weekend in Conference Room Mustang 3. As a society, we produce a lot of waste, much of which ends up in landfills and the ocean and is not biodegradable. How can we change our habits as a nation on a large enough scale to make a difference? And should government have a role to play regulating our product consumption, such as banning plastic bags and straws?
Good question.
Is that for me? How does
Yes.
this work exactly? That's for me. Okay. Well, I guess what I'd say is this. If you actually look at the numbers on plastic bags and plastic straws, they make us feel good. They probably don't have that much effect, given the enormity of the problem. Every little bit helps, I suppose. I think you have to go to the big things, and if you look at a lot of the numbers, what they suggest is the real waste on that front is coming from other parts of the world. We're about 5% of the world's population. The other 95% is elsewhere. So I'm not particularly big in terms of mandates on that front. I do believe in incentives, though. I remember as a boy the notion of 5 cents or 10 cents on a bottle or a can was a big deal. And I still think that government has a role in incentivizing certain behaviors. I don't know that you need a statewide or a nationwide mandate. I think it needs to be handled at a local level. So, for instance, when I was governor, what I said was, I believe in federalism, that the decisions most local to people are the ones that make the most sense, and that, for instance, coastal counties or coastal municipalities, if they want to impose a straw or a bag ban, North counties did, and a number of municipalities did on the coast of South Carolina, they ought to be free to do so. But I don't think it should, again, be a federal mandate. I think that ultimately these solutions need to basically work their way up from the bottom.
Mary Ann, thanks for your question. We go next to James.
Well, my name is James. I represent Group 24. One thing that came up is in our group is how can benefits that are given to illegal immigrants be justified and be a burden on the American taxpayer?
You say, how can they be justified?
That's correct, Governor.
I don't think that they can. I mean, I think that there are certain rights that go with being Americans and there are responsibilities that go with being Americans. I think it is a different thing if you have somebody that's here on true asylum matters and a true asylum basis. I think that we want to, again, extend a helping hand, or if it's a crisis from a natural disaster or from a geopolitical disaster. But in terms of an open-ended mandate on the American taxpayer saying we're just going to give the same package of benefits to people who cross into this country illegally that we would give to American citizens is not something that makes sense to me.
Thanks for your question. Next is Donnie. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, sir. I'm fortunate to be part in representing a group to discuss minimum wage, and a very intelligent group at that. As they looked at the difference between $7.25 and $15, the word sticker shock came up. I'm also part of a group that was very bold and would like to make a suggestion, and would it be of a consideration to start at the federal wage at $10 and then let the states escalate from there?
I like your thinking. As was just mentioned, I'm a big fan of federalism, of not all decisions being decided in Washington, D.C. For instance, I'm a very conservative Republican. When I was governor of South Carolina, though, a number of different counties passed legislation in that county to raise sales tax. And my point, though Republicans pushed back against me, I said, look, if you believe in federalism, it's got to go all the way through. And therefore, those counties should be free to raise the sales tax, though I would not do it if it was, again, my decision. They ought to be free to do so. I think the same here applies with minimum wage. I do not believe in raising the minimum wage because if you look at the data, it's fairly conclusive in the way that it knocks out people in their ability to grab the first rung on the economic ladder in a starter job. For instance, as a teenager in your first work experiences. And so I don't like it as a federal mandate. But again, if a municipality or a county or a state feels strongly, if you believe in federalism, you ought to be able to let them, again, go the direction they want to go. And it may be counterproductive economically, but they ought to be allowed that choice. I'd give you another example on this notion of federalism that we're alluding to here. When I was in Congress, I voted in support of a number of different provisions that would allow legal businesses in Colorado in the marijuana business to access the federal banking system. Because, again, if you believe in federalism, the states that have passed it, those businesses ought to be treated as any other legal business in that state. But that's not what we do at the federal level. We come in and we say, I tell you what, though it passed statute in Colorado to make it legal, we're in essence going to, in a de facto way, make it illegal still at the federal level by preventing you from accessing the banking system. So that's a long-winded way of saying I believe that those decisions on minimum wage ought to be made at the local level. There should not be a federal mandate that raises it up to $15 an hour.
You know, since you brought it up, Governor, I'm curious, do you support continuing to have marijuana as a Schedule I drug at the federal level, the most serious kind of drug?
I haven't really looked at that. Again, I've approached this through the prism of federalism. I suspect not would be the answer, given the penalties that are entailed there and given the way that I think there's a societal shift on that front and given what a number of states have done.
Thanks a lot. Donnie, thanks for your question. Jameez next. Janice? Jameez. Sorry.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I have a foreign policy question from small group number 12. The question is, how do we, as a country, take into consideration other countries' cultures, ideologies, and values when deciding whether or not we intervene in their conflicts?
Well, I think it's something that we've historically been atrocious at. It's amazing to me to think that in the 1950s, the United States went into Iran and toppled, through CIA efforts and other, a democratically elected leader and put in the Shah of Iran. And then fast forward, a lot of different backs and forths, and we haven't acted in good faith in allowing other countries to go their direction. Again, I keep going back to a very simple thought. We are 5% of the world's population. We're about 20% of the world's economy. We have a disproportionate voice economically, but we do not own the world. And I think it's a mistake to intervene as consistently as we have on a whole different range of fronts around the world. That's why when I was in Congress, I took any number of votes against our operations in the Middle East. And our point was, if we're going to have operations in the Middle East, at the very least, Congress ought to authorize war efforts. And what we've gotten into in the modern era is, with both Republicans and Democrats, the executive branch going in, committing troops. Once the troops are in, the legislative branch says, well, we can't, cut the knees out from underneath the troops. We got to continue funding. And here we are 18 years later with operations in the Middle East. My point has been simply this. Body bags do not come home to Washington, D.C. They come back to congressional districts across this country. And therefore, I think it's incumbent upon members of Congress to actually take a heads up or a heads down vote on whether or not you want to risk, again, sons and daughters of your constituents in this particular conflict. I think there needs to be a much greater threshold of political risk for members of Congress with regard to operations. And as to your basic question, should we take into account the subtleties of Shia versus Sunni and go down the list of different ethnicities and cross tabs from the standpoint of different backgrounds, perspectives, religion, and other in our foreign policy? Yes, that's what we have a State Department for, but at times we don't listen to them.
Jim East, thanks a lot for your question. We'll go next to Kathy. Welcome.
Good evening. In Group 11, we were discussing taxes and the economy, and our question was, if we do decide to raise taxes on the wealthy, how do we prevent them from using loopholes to avoid paying any increase in taxes?
Let me get to that question, but I'm thinking here about the question, I guess, the first question, which was on the environment with plastic and straws, which isn't exactly related to your economy question. But I do want to say this. When I was governor, my second go-round in my second run for office, I was actually endorsed by the Sierra Club, which is sort of a weird action that doesn't happen a lot with Republican governors, but I did so because I had been focused on the environment and conservation to fairly great lengths, but I'll come back to that in a minute. As to how do you avoid tax avoidance, it's tough. If you look at the overall revenue stream to our federal government, it's been consistently about 18% of GDP. In other words, about 18% of the total of all the economic activity in our country goes off to the federal government. And that's been true, again, really since World War II, in a high-rate environment, in a low-rate environment, regardless of the environment, that's about the take. I think that particularly as you get to the upper levels, people become incredibly creative in avoiding taxes, given the way in which they can hire a team of lawyers that you and I can't when we go to H&R Block. And so what do you do? I mean, I think that whatever law you have, you enforce. I think that there could probably be done more on the enforcement front. And I guess it underscores the reason that I'm for either a fair tax or a flat tax. You got to simplify the system. As long as you have the system that can be carved out, manipulated, and in part controlled by a wide swath of lobbyists in Washington, D.C., who are able to get teeny little provisions in giant omnibus or appropriation bills, we're going to continue to have this problem. So I think it goes to the heart of the need for tax simplification.
Kathy, thanks a lot for your question. Elizabeth is next. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. From a healthcare question from group number 28. Speaker Pelosi just released a drug plan requiring drug makers to negotiate prices. Why do we not have bipartisan support to solve the problem of increasing prescription drug prices?
I think the answer is, Big Pharma has a very powerful lobby in Washington, D.C., on the Republican and Democratic sides. I think that the problem with negotiated prices, and I'm for it, there's certainly a value to buying in bulk. It's what Walmart and Costco and a variety of other folks do on a regular basis with their suppliers. And the United States government and its different healthcare purveyors are huge buyers of healthcare services. So I do think negotiated prices make sense. But again, you can only go so far on capitation. You basically have three variables on the healthcare front. You have cost, you have access, and you have quality. And my experience in looking at this conundrum has been, okay, you lower cost, but then you begin to affect either access or quality. And so if you look, for instance, with Medicaid, you have doctors in rural parts of South Carolina that won't take medicated patients anymore based on the capitation that's in place, limiting access to vital healthcare services for some people in rural parts of the state that I used to represent. So I'd say I'm open to negotiating prices. I'd be careful about capitation, because if you take it too far below market, you begin to see people actually leave the system. That hurts the access portion of the equation.
Elizabeth, thanks a lot for your question. Lennox is next. Lennox?
Good evening, Governor. This may be a follow-up to your tax simplification statement. In 2018, there were 60 Fortune 500 companies that paid no income tax on $79 billion worth of profits. What is your plan to address this inequity?
Well, I'm 2 weeks into this. I don't have a documented plan out there yet. We're in the process of bringing folks on that can help me, again, in formatting plans that would address that. Let me begin with simply what I believe, which is I think it's wrong. It's not fair, and this is Warren Buffett, I think, who's spoken eloquently on this front, that you could have him paying less in taxes than the person out front answering the phones. That's not right. I think for a tax system to be fair and to be bought into by the American public, it has to be equitable. It has to be transparent. It has to read its objectives in terms of revenue. But the first rung on the ladder is it equitable? And our current system is not. It's unthinkable to me that some of these big corporations can get out with paying less than you or I pay in the way of taxes.
You were a member of the House of Representatives during the first part of the Trump administration, weren't you?
I was.
Did you vote for the corporate tax cut?
I did. But let me address that since you brought it up. A couple different things. One, I made national news at the time when I said that this is not a middle-class tax cut. And it was being sold in many quarters as a middle-class tax cut. I said it's not that. It's fundamentally a corporate tax reduction and restructuring bill. End of story. And I wrote fairly extensively, you can still pull it up on my whole Facebook post from those days, on the merits and the demerits of the plan. If you looked at our corporate tax rate relative to other corporate rates around the industrialized world, our rate was indeed high. And this was a bill that originated with Ron Wyden, a Democrat from the West Coast. It was ultimately picked up by Speaker Ryan. It became his sort of baby. He ran with it. And Trump certainly took credit for it. If you really look at the person who orchestrated it, worked on it, it was Kevin Brady from Texas, and it was Speaker Paul Ryan that really drove the legislative agenda. Their objective was, how do we become more competitive in our country relative to other country lines, so we avoid corporate inversions, we avoid corporate relocations, and we're as inviting for capital as other places around the world. That was the objective. I said at that time, maybe they come back and invest capital, or maybe they just do a corporate buyback. You don't know. And in fact, they've done more buyback than investment in some quarters, and I think that's problematic. I support the bill, though, because if you look at, again, the revenue stream to the federal government, it's about 18%. It didn't materially change that number. And so I said, you could argue for or against it. I think you could probably argue that individuals in some cases need more relief than the corporate body. But it keeps our revenue stream about the same. And significantly, from the standpoint of deficit, if you look at the overall revenue stream to the federal government, over the next 10 years, it's projected to be $43 trillion. That's without the tax cut. With the tax cut, it will be $41.5 trillion. That's a 2.5% difference. And so you could be for or against it based on one's political philosophy, but to blame it on the deficit, which is what some people have done, is, I think, a bit disingenuous, given it's a 2.5% difference over the 10-year window of the tax bill. And while people make great noise about that $1.5 trillion, people are surprisingly quiet about the $1 trillion+ deficit that we're going to run this year and next year and the year after that, based on the deficits caused by a variety of other factors.
Governor, thank you for the clarification. Lennox, thank you for your question. We go on next to Ilana. Ilana, welcome.
Good evening. On behalf of Group 14, I'd like to ask you a question about immigration. Are there diplomatic strategies you would employ to help foreign governments make better home environments as a means of dealing with immigration?
It's a mixed review. I'd say this: we need to be careful about nation building. It just hasn't worked out that well for us. I think that there is a value to the foreign aid package, but the foreign aid package, fundamentally, it's about 1% of the revenue stream from the federal government. It's fundamentally an Israel and Egypt budget. If you really look at the numbers, that's where the overwhelming bulk of our foreign aid goes. It goes to those two countries, Israel and Egypt. And so then the question is, are you going to plus it up, or are you going to take from those two countries to, again, address a whole host of places? So if you look at El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras, I mean, clearly problem spots, clearly a place for money being spent. I think the administration has been mistaken in some of what they've done in essence, punishing those places. But at the end of the day, you can't plan a democracy. It's what was, I think, wrong with Rumsfeld's original presumption in the Middle East. We'll just go plan a democracy. You know, democratic tendencies have a lot of different building parts, and the idea that you can just come in from thousands of miles away, throw a few thoughts and a few things in, I don't think works. And so, yes, I do believe in foreign aid. I think we need to be more strategic about it. And I stopped, though, at the line of quasi-nation building, which I think we oftentimes sort of back our way into.
Alana, thanks for your question. Let's go next to John.
Hello, Governor. Group 15, preceding my question, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Afghanistan from 1967 to 1969. And of course, like all of us, have been so affected by what has happened since then. My question is, negotiations with the Taliban have stopped, and terrorist attacks in Kabul have just become more and more devastating, and they continue. What new strategies, as president, would you pursue to stabilize Afghanistan and its government and reduce or end United States military involvement there? And in your opinion, do you believe the Taliban can be trusted to a political settlement?
I don't. I don't think they've proven themselves good actors on the world stage. I remember back the first time I was in Congress, I remember the Clinton administration had negotiated with North Korea, and basically the deal was, we'll give you some money for stopping your nuclear program. They got the money, and they didn't stop the nuclear program. I can't imagine the Taliban being much different. That being said, again, we've tried an 18-year experiment in different quarters of that world. I think that we have worn out our welcome. I am for troops coming home. It's tragic what's happened in that part of the world. I commend your service in that part of the world. You saw it at a time when the conditions were much more benign than they are now. But I think that America's position in that part of the world has eroded. I don't think it's been raised despite the trillions, literally trillions of dollars that we spent. And I don't know that we have more in the way of security or stability. And so while I respect, General Mattis tremendously, and General Petraeus and others who've been long on deeper levels of involvement, I just don't think it's worked. And at some point you need to call it and say, okay, let's try something else. Let's step away. I think that there's a fair amount of ill will that comes with having troops on the ground in any place over an extended period of time. Let's pull away and let's try other more diplomatic efforts from afar.
John, thanks for your question. Next, William.
Hello, Governor. Thank you for your time and participation. So some of my group wanted to ask you about an Appalachian Trail, but that will not be your question for tonight. So my question is about climate change and alternative energy. Could the private sector do a better job at managing the environment than the government? And what incentives could we propose for the private sector to do so?
Say the first part of that, the first phrase though. In what?
In alternative energy or climate change.
Yeah. Climate change. I'm trying to write it all down here. Well, first let me address your comment on the Appalachian Trail. You threw it out there. Let's see what else I know. It's a rather humbling journey to go on, to have blown yourself up as I did, and to go on an apology tour with voters back home and to say I'm sorry, to say that I believe in the Christian model of repentance and a second chance, and then to be afforded one, which I was. So that happened 10 years ago in my life. But what was interesting was in its aftermath, a couple years later, the folks who knew me best back home said, look, we don't in any way approve of how you handle this chapter of life. You let us down, you let yourself down, but we know you and we trust you, and we'll give you a second chance. We'll actually send you to the United States Congress to represent us in Washington, which I did for the following 6 years. That is a very humbling journey to go on. And so all I would say is this. I wish I didn't mess up, but I did. But I think what's important is that I've tried to own it. And if you talk to folks back home in South Carolina, they say, like the guy or dislike the guy, he's owned it. I mean, I didn't pay lawyers to try and make somebody go away or to hide things or do anything else. I owned it. And I think it's important in the wake of failure, particularly public failure in a position of public trust, that you own it and you get it out there and you talk about it, which we've done with the folks that I've represented back home, and then you hopefully learn from it. And I think that each one of us has some chapter of our life that we wish we could push wide and play and forward on, but that's not how life works. And so I think that, the downs of your life can be actually chapters of life where you can learn the most. You can learn more about your own humanity and how we all have feet of clay. You can learn more about empathy toward others and the situations that they face. You can walk away with a greater level of humility in terms of recognizing that you're not perfect and therefore accepting the imperfections in others. So it was a big event in my life. And I respect the fact that you'd have questions about it. As to your questions with regard to alternative energy, what I would say is this. I think we got to find some way out. I mean, I'm a Republican that's somewhat, I guess, odd or rare in that I've said, wait, I don't get it. What we can't say is that we believe in science. Science can do amazing things in our bodies. I mean, going back to the pharmaceutical conversation we were having a moment ago, I mean, amazing drugs that can do amazing things, and doctors and modern medicine can do amazing things. We believe in science with regard to our bodies, but we don't believe in science with regard to the rest of the larger landscape that we live in. Are you kidding me? And so I've said I believe in climate change as a Republican. I think it's real. Because you can't say I believe in the scientists over here, but I don't believe in them over here. Either you believe in science or you don't. And so I do believe it's real. I do believe it needs to be addressed. And we're going to have to make some tough choices. If you look at the numbers on renewables, so I certainly believe in wind and energy, and hopefully someday there'll be something with regard to tidal and wave. But it can't handle base load. But still the question we have to confront as society is how do we handle base load requirements in terms of energy? And so what I've said to a lot of my environmental friends is we've got to take some other look at nuclear. And I get it that a lot of people don't like nuclear given the waste component. But relative to staying on the carbon track, I think it's more desirable than staying on the carbon track given what's happening in terms of CO2 emissions and their implications for greenhouse effect. And so I think that one of my answers is certainly continue the strain and the push and reinvest some of those monies that we're spending in the Middle East and other military operations in those parts of the world. Put that money into renewables. But concurrent with it, I think we need to incentivize nuclear given its impact with regard to CO2.
William, thanks a lot for your question. And Governor, thanks a lot for handling them all. Good to see you.
Yes, sir.